John, for the Wolf in Winter, we have your character, Charlie Parker, once again in action. I'm always curious with a writer like you, who has a character like Charlie Parker, is he with you all the time, or do you sit down and take him out of the suitcase?
I suppose it's always kind of at the back of your head, because even when you're not writing a book, you're thinking about writing a book. There's that lovely Raymond Chandler quote where he was asked how does he spend his days, and he said, well, I spend 7 hours a day sleeping, 3 hours a day eating, 4 hours a day writing, and the rest of the time thinking about writing. Even when you're working on something else, you're aware that ticking over in the back of your mind is the next book. And so he is always there. It's just that he probably comes to the forefront when I sit down to write a book. And there's a lot of him in me, and a lot of me in him, but I haven't reached that point that some writers do, where they seem to meld with their characters and start believing that they can go and start fights on the street and walk away from them. So I like looking at the world through his eyes, I suppose is the way. It's like putting on a filter and seeing the world slightly differently. And that's part of the pleasure of returning to him, I think.
Do you know in this case, for this particular book, John, what elements came together to spark this particular story?
Part of it was a fascination with the Green Man mythos, this idea of pagan symbols and faces on old churches. But then I discovered in the way that...
The Green Man, let me stop you there.
Sorry.
The Green Man is something which I think I've seen in movies. There's a Kingsley Amis book as well,
yeah,
I think, called The Green Man. That old myth is something people kind of know about. It's kind of a sort of a nature god, but nasty.
Yeah, we have that awareness of him, that sense of pagan symbolism melding with Christian churches and Christian belief systems. And so that was quite interesting. But then in the way that sometimes a little shiny object falls into your lap as a writer and you think, I will have that, I discovered the group called the Familists. I was reading about nonconformist beliefs in England. I should do when you've nothing better to do of a Saturday evening. And the Familists were really interesting. They were religious chameleons at a time when the institutions of the state were cracking down on people who were not adhering to a strict Anglican tradition. They blended into other congregations. They were very peculiar people. They believed there was a time before Adam and Eve. They believed in a distinction between God and nature. And so they got around a lot of these strictures by saying, well, look, we're a family. Families were allowed to meet in groups, but nobody else was allowed to meet in a group of more than 4 because there was a fear that they were going to be worshipping on the side. So they were very good at hiding in communities, and they were rumoured to have killed people. It may just be propaganda, but there were rumours that they had, when they were discovered, they were not above killing people to protect themselves. And when you find something like that as a writer, that's just a gift. You take that because you just couldn't make those people up.
But this, of course, it's not an historical novel at all. I mean, it's set in contemporary United States, a town called Prosperous in Maine. It's an interesting idea that these people could still be there. That's spooky, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's what's lovely. I mean, if they are capable of disguising themselves, and it's not clear what happened to them, that's what's really interesting about them. The Familists literally they disappeared. And it was assumed simply that a lot of them became Quakers, but there were some who had very, very extreme beliefs and were not probably going to become Quakers and were not going to blend into mainstream religion in that sense. So yeah, it is one of those things that's interesting to look at as a writer and say, where did they go? Because so many people went to the New World to escape religious persecution. They thought they could build their own communities there. So it's not beyond the bounds of plausibility that some of them might have gone over to New England.
Now these people they brought their church with them, brick by brick. And in this town of Prosperous, the people who were originally these families have been living for hundreds of years. The same families running the town, the very same people, same bloodline the whole way through. Was there anything in America, or in Maine in particular, a place you know very well, was there anything there that made you think this actually could happen?
Oh, there are towns in Maine where you can trace back people who came off like the next ship after the Mayflower. Maine was one of the first places to be settled. There are a lot of quite remote communities who are not particularly welcoming to people from outside. They call them from away, people from away. And you can have generations of your family in Maine. I mean, you could have 3 or 4 generations of your family living in the state, or having lived in the state, and you still won't be considered as a Mainer. They have very distinct beliefs about what constitutes being part of their community. And so, yeah, so you can see, I quite like the fact that there's such a distinction in Maine between the East Coast, which is where the tourists go, which is quite lovely, which is beaches and lobster shacks and all of that stuff. And then an interior, which is very hostile in terms of its landscape, very difficult to settle, very poor, and quite insular. And as a writer, that's a bit of a gift, those two distinctions within one geographical space.
The book, though, starts off as if we're not going to head into that sort of territory at all. We have missing people, we have murders, we have the stock material of a good thriller. And then it goes supernatural. Was that always the intention from the beginning? And I know that supernatural element has been there in all the books, but this one starts as if it could be a missing person story.
Yeah, it's both at the same time. I think it's simultaneously the most supernatural and least supernatural of the books, because the supernatural element hinges on one scene. It's something that somebody sees from a distance through the sight of a rifle, isn't sure whether he's seen it or not. But as somebody in the book says, it doesn't matter whether the thing exists or doesn't exist. What matters is the harm people do by their beliefs. And I think mystery fiction is a very good mechanism for exploring issues of morality, of compassion, of empathy, of beliefs, because you can sneak all this stuff under the wire. People are reading it, their flight to Malaga, they're reading it to be entertained. And I'm not above escapism. I think escapism is one of the great things that literature offers us, that ability to just move into another world entirely. I quite like unsettling the reader. I quite like the blurring of that very rational mystery tradition going back to, Dupin and the Poe stories and Sherlock Holmes and Poirot, with the slightly older and odder tradition, which kind of comes out of a lot of the English supernatural stories I read as a boy, particularly 19th century and early 20th century English supernatural fiction. I probably stopped reading when M.R. James dies in the 30s. That's the end of my fascination with that tradition. And when I began writing, I think I wanted to horrify the reader slightly. I thought that you had to shock the reader. And now I really want to unsettle the reader. And part of it is just having those moments, those odd moments, just enough of them in the book to make people feel a sense of dislocation in the fiction, I suppose.
Those odd moments raise very interesting questions, though. I mean, as you say, you're trying to sneak things in under the radar. One of the things that's being discussed in this book is the nature of God, the nature of a God. You talk about, people invent their own God. And if people invent their own God, that's a real God.
Yeah, absolutely. If you believe in it, it's your God. And one of the questions asked is, what happens when you stop believing in a God? Does the God go away? Does it simply cease to be? And so I'm fascinated with those. I was brought up a Catholic. I'm not a very good Catholic. Thank God Pope Benedict's gone, because I always felt at some point he was going to round us all up and burn us in St. Peter's Square. But I can't shake those beliefs. And I think one of the common traits in the fiction that I love, the mystery fiction that I love, or at least the characters at the heart of them, I'm thinking of James Lee Brooks' Dave Robichaud, I'm thinking of Dennis Lehane's Patrick Kenzie, to some degree Michael Connolly's Harry Bosch, is that they're all characters in search of redemption. And if you come from a Catholic background, or if you come from a Christian background, that word redemption is freighted with a certain amount of spiritual baggage. And I think something of that has seeped into the books that I write.
Because the bad guys are after it too. They're after redemption as well. And you have this character called the Collector, who's kind of redeeming people for his own pleasure.
For his own purpose. And the other thing in the book is that most people don't set out to be evil. Most people are selfish. Most people are self-interested. And actually at the heart of the book is a man called Moreland, Lucas Moreland. And Moreland is the chief of police in this town. And Moreland gradually gets corrupted. Moreland wants to do what he has to do to protect the town. He wants to keep it safe. He wants to keep its citizens safe. But he sells his soul to do it. And he becomes aware of his own corruption. He's aware of his own monstrosity. And that's interesting. I do like that question in the books of, where does evil come from? What is the nature of evil? Is there a kind of wellspring that we can draw on in really extreme circumstances where you look at something a human being does and think, I have no conception of how a person can behave in that way, how they can live after doing something like this. And compared to kind of what is that generic human selfishness, human self-interest, greed and need. I read somewhere recently, I think it was an interview with Josh Brolin, who used to play the stock markets. And he said all human endeavour can be boiled down to those two things, greed and need, what we want and what we need. And that governs all the things that we do.
Well, would you view the word evil itself, is evil a supernatural concept?
The books suggest that it can be. I dislike hearing it used in terms of court cases. I dislike hearing it used when there's a shooting atrocity and people use the term evil about the shooter. I think it's a get-out clause that enables us not to think about the reasons behind it. So I think we have to be very careful about using the word evil in association with human beings. Human beings are weak. If you look at prisoners especially in U.S. prisons where they're doing a lot of research on them, the number of them who are mentally ill, the number of them who have some kind of neurological difficulty, that's not evil. That's somebody malfunctioning. But that idea of what is evil, is there, if we believe in a force of good in the universe, do we also then, in that kind of Nietzschean way, have to believe in something that's its opposite? And the books explore those themes.
But there's a communal evil here in that the whole town is involved. I don't want to give anything away here, but the whole town is involved in protecting itself and has been for many, many years, and will do anything to protect itself. Then you're into the area of cults and why were there Nazis and all those sorts of questions.
But not just those things. In the last couple of years, I've begun getting a lot of email and posts particularly from people on the right in the US who feel that I'm unusually vindictive towards them, or that that the people in my books tend to be, who are evil, tend to be wealthy or tend to be powerful and privileged. And the point I tend to make is that I don't take those labels of conservative and liberal on board in quite the same way, because in the European tradition they have no meaning in the way that they do in the US. The books are socially concerned. The books operate in a real world, and it's a world where increasingly the gap between the poor and the wealthy is growing larger and larger and larger. And in the US, a lot of the debates about it are being conducted at the extremes. And mystery fiction, it's always, certainly American mystery fiction, which is very different from British mystery fiction. British mystery fiction tends to be about order, the rule of order and the rule of law. It is about maintaining order in a society. American mystery fiction, right from the beginning, has tended to be about the importance of somebody making a stand on behalf of those who are powerless, those who don't have wealth, those who are immigrants, who are poverty-stricken, who are women, for whom the forces of law and order simply won't make the same stance. And so you need somebody from outside to act on their behalf. There's a real sense of social justice that has always run through American mystery fiction. And so I see myself in some ways as being part of that tradition. Why would you write mystery fiction and be on the side of the powerful?
Well, in this case, you do make a very strong case for homeless people in America. And they're all, some of the best characters in this are homeless people. The most interesting and multi-layered characters are homeless people.
Portland, Maine has a law which says that if there is a homeless person on the streets, a bed has to be found for them. And by a bed, it can just be a plastic chair in a lobby, but it's somewhere they can be safe, because the temperature drops so low that if you're out on the streets in winter in Maine, you're going to die. And increasingly there are people in Maine who say, well, we shouldn't be doing this. We're pandering to these people. We're making life easy for them. Nobody chooses to be homeless. Nobody chooses to be poor. A certain set of circumstances come into play, and suddenly you find yourself falling through the net. And again, it goes back to what I was saying about mystery fiction, about those traditions of mystery fiction. Edmund Burke, the Irish writer Edmund Burke, once said, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to stand by and do nothing. That's a consistent theme in American mystery fiction, that idea of not standing by. And so Parker refuses to stand by, and he refuses, whether it's somebody who's homeless, whether it's somebody who's been let down by the forces of law. It's a question of justice. It's a question of being a moral human being.
On the other side of it, on the evil side of it, on the bad side of your story, you have some people who are clearly monstrous, but you have other people who are doing terrible things who otherwise seem like quite decent people, and they're very tolerant of gay marriage in this particular town. They're very tolerant of all sorts of things that make them seem slightly liberal, but they also do other things that we don't want to talk about.
Yeah, in part I think it was partly a response to some of the emails that I've been getting, and some of the letters where people seem to feel that I was demonizing conservatives only. I have a suspicion of wealth and privilege when it's not used to benefit the society beneath it. I have people who feel that because they're privileged, somehow God has smiled upon them in a way that it hasn't on these other people. Then we can get into something like predestination, where you think, you're poor and you're sinful because you've already been damned. And so it's kind of curious. I very much wanted these to be the kind of ride-on people that, if I met them in a bar, I think, God, these are lovely people. These are the kind of people I need to be around. They're good liberals. They believe in getting along with the people around them. They believe in supporting all the right-on causes. But there is a huge, poisonous corruption inside them, and it's been going on for so long that they have simply ceased to notice it. As somebody says, you can become familiar with anything, you can become used to anything if you do it for long enough.
You mentioned the chief of police. Moreland is a great character in this book. Do you ever worry as a writer when you introduce a character like that into the mix, that people will get too attracted to that character? I mean, I was rooting for Moreland a lot, and he's the one that did a lot of the killing.
Yeah, I want people to root for him. It's very easy to root for the good people. I mean, that's easy. It's very easy to bring on the guy in the white hat who doesn't appear to have any great degree of moral complexity or hasn't been touched by unpleasantness or evil and support that person. The real trick is to make people see the human side of a character that we should be appalled by. It's that I often come back to Anthony Hopkins when he was asked, about playing Hannibal on screen. How do you portray somebody so monstrous? And he said, you find the little part of yourself that could be that person, that little seed of anger, and you expand it into a performance. There's no point in creating grotesques that people can't connect with. What you have to do is create kind of believable human beings, and then let people see how they have become corrupted. Because you don't want people just to cast them aside. You want people to feel a kind of sorrow, because this man, under other circumstances, could have done something genuinely wonderful. This man he has power, he has commitment, he has a strong belief system, he has his own personal morality. It's just that it has become skewed.
See, I can't follow up this question now because I don't want to give away what happens. But again, as a writer, you create someone like Moreland, the reader gets to like Moreland. I want Moreland in the next book.
Yeah, well, one of the things in the Parker books, I think, is that nobody is safe. And the books are clearly moving towards a kind of conclusion. And even in this book, Parker himself seems to be shadowed, and he sees a shadow over the people around him. At one point he describes his friend Angel as, where mortality has shadowed him like a bird of prey mantling its food. There's an awareness of mortality running through the books. And so it's not just the minor characters, it's the major characters too. Nobody is really safe. At the end, it's going to come for all of us.
I have two other questions I want to ask you, and the mortality one is I want to finish on that. But in terms of, you touched on this earlier, they said in your early books you kind of wanted to horrify people.
Sure.
And I remember when your first book came out, I was going, whoa, John Connolly, are you okay? You all right? Usual thing, projecting.
Yes, yeah.
Thinking, this guy, this is too twisted, The violence in this is much more matter of fact. I mean, there's less sort of pornographic detail. People are quite casually dispatched at times in this book. Suddenly and quickly, they're gone before you realize it. Bang. Yeah. Have you deliberately toned that down for your own artistic reasons, or because maybe it's not wise to terrify people too much?
No, in the beginning, when I wrote the first book especially, I wanted to see how somebody like Parker could be made, essentially, how somebody could have seen something so awful that it breaks, something inside them breaks. Gradually as a writer you realise that less is more sometimes. You can do it more subtly than that, and you don't have to linger. And this issue of violence in mystery fiction, it's not an exact science. We tread a careful line. You will overstep it on occasion. I'm very aware now that I don't want to linger on wounds to the body. I don't want to linger on human suffering. I'm particularly careful about being an equal opportunity inflictor of violence, if you want. It's very easy to get an emotional response from the reader from hurting a woman or a child, because we respond differently to violence inflicted on women and children than we do to men. There's a part of us that thinks, well, that's what happens to men, and it's true. A lot of the violence is young men on young men. A lot of the violence towards women tends to be in a domestic situation. They tend to be hurt by people that they know. But you don't often see that in mystery fiction because it's not a very attractive thing to write about. So I'm very aware of not using women in that way, because I've seen it's still something that's done a lot in the genre, and I'm very, very conscious of it now, perhaps in a way that I wasn't when I was a younger writer.
Do you think, though, people would need to have read the first book to know what Parker saw?
No,
because I remember it.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what he thinks about it.
I think there are ways to remind the reader. When you're writing a book,
you do in this.
Yeah, you don't want to discourage people who are coming to the series for the first time. And certainly, after you've written 12 or 13 books, you're talking to two sets of readers. You're assuming a set of knowledge on the part of people who've read the 10 or 11 or 12 books before it, but you're also aware that new readers are coming in. And they don't want to be coming in like somebody coming in at the end of a joke where you haven't held the build up to it. So you give them enough hints that they know what's happening. But if you read the novels in sequence, I think there's a different impact, inevitably. I differ about this. I remember Lee Child saying that he wanted anybody to be able to come to the Reacher novels at any point in them. Reacher didn't have a history. He didn't have a memory. I very consciously went in the other direction. I wanted Parker to have a history, and this history has been built up over 12 books. And if you follow the series through, you see that there's another story in the background, and it's being given to you in little pieces and little pieces. And I think readers are prepared to go along with that.
You mentioned earlier, John, that the main supernatural moment in this is seen from a distance through a telescopic sight of a rifle. But there's another massive supernatural moment in this as well, which, whether it's supernatural or not, it's also reality for everybody, in that there's a moment of death, or possible death, and we'll not say whose death that is, where you actually discuss someone on the point of going into the afterlife, if there is one, or staying here. Mm-hmm. You're having to make a kind of a call there on, is the supernatural actually a reality?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure I do need to make the call. I think there's a certain ambiguity running through the novels about this. Yeah, it's very hard to discuss this without giving anybody away. But certainly, yes, there's a whole section of the novel that teeters on a consciousness and where this consciousness happens to be at the time. And I trust the reader. I think the reader, everybody reads a book in a different way. Everybody brings their own history, their own personal experiences, their own preconceptions, their own belief systems into a book and applies them. And depending upon your belief system, you're going to read those sections of the book in a different way from another reader. And I quite like that. I trust my readers. I know that they're intelligent. Stupid people don't read books. There's no point in chasing them. They're not going to do it. The people who read books tend to be reasonably smart, and they'll go down paths, and they don't mind being challenged too much, and they don't mind some questions being left in the air. And I think that's useful, and I think that's good.
Thank you, John.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.